Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's State of the Market update with the Sultan of SONAR, Strickland. So, starting off this week with a little outbound tender rejection index weekly change. For those of you that are unfamiliar, I've talked about this a few times before, where it's giving you the absolute percentage change between 7 days ago and today. So, looking at some of these darker colored market areas, you can tell where the biggest significant jumps have happened over the last 7 days. So, for instance, I'm looking at St. Louis right here and Chicago right here. These look to be some elevated tender rejection index levels. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with St. Louis or Chicago. Let's see here. Let's pick one to go see what's happening there. So there's Chicago. So Chicago over the last 7 days showing a pretty good jump. Let's see, today the 13th, so back to the 6th. Pretty good jump in tender rejections. Now, this is in stark contrast to the rest of the country. So as I pull up the OTRI USA, which is the tender rejection index for the country, you can see there's a huge gap here. And Chicago is a pretty big market. There's a lot going on in Chicago, a huge amount of rail activity there, intermodal and whatnot. This time of year is a pretty big deal. So Chicago is having a pretty, there's probably some opportunities there for the brokers and carriers to kind of increase their rates. And if we dug a little deeper into the Chicago market and kind of went into some more granular level on the lanes, the outbound tender rejection index for Chicago to Dallas is now, looks like it's bumping up. So I like to go and pick some of the bigger lanes. I know that they may not be the more populous lanes, but Chicago to Dallas is a huge outbound lane for the Chicago market. A lot of trucks moving up and down that corridor, especially when the rails get burdened. They'll flow over into the truck market a lot of times. And that one looks to be moving up a little bit. Let's pick another area, another lane to look at. So going into the northeast, let's see, Chicago to Allentown. Allentown's actually a very strong lane. Again, we're seeing that little uptick in tender rejection. So that means that there's probably not enough capacity moving in that lane. And I think the northeast corridor, generally not a great area for carriers to move into because it's hard to get back out. But we're seeing a good bit of movement. And this, again, is in stark contrast to the rest of the country, which has been cooling for the majority of the last month. We've talked about the potential for it to turn back up in the month of August. It doesn't appear to have happened yet. Chicago's been one of those markets that we've been looking at as kind of an outlier. It has not really moved the same direction as the rest of the freight market has in terms of tender rejections. Also, let's see if we can find another lane in the area. So I think we talked about St. Louis. St. Louis was another Midwestern area. So we're seeing some decent kind of spark of life in the Midwest over the last week. And again, you see it's bumping up. And now it's starting to kind of correct a little bit. One of the things I found here is not only do you go in and look at lanes, but you can go in and look at modes of transportation, or trailer type, I should call it. So this is going to be the reefer tender rejection index for St. Louis. And if you don't have enough volume in each market for the particular granularity of the tender rejection, you will not see a value for it. So there needs to be significant amount of data for you to create a statistic on something. And there you go. Reefer tender rejections are high. Let's go ahead and throw the van tender rejection index on there to see if that has any significance. And no, it's moving right along the same curve as the regular one. But reefers appear to be at a pretty good level. And the van's still pretty elevated as well. A lot of times the reefer will, when it's unavailable, it's a hot time of year, people will start trying to maybe put more of their stuff in vans. Conversely, in the winter, when reefers aren't as in high demand, they tend to be utilized for other types of goods in that respect. So I guess the lesson of the week is that the Midwest, in contrast to the rest of the country, is showing a pretty good spike in tender rejections. Not necessarily a huge one, but there may be signs of life there yet. Let's check the port activity real quick before we call it a week. And we see, again, the FreightWaves Baltic Index, China to North American East and China to North American West Coast, showing huge elevations in port activity. The port volume should start really picking up. A lot of this as well has something to do with rate increases as well as capacity constraints, so it's not a straight volume play, but we can see that the ports are still quite active this time of year, as we would expect them to be. Moving into the middle of the second quarter, we're about to see things, well, they could make or break. They could go one way or the other. We think this time of year is pretty indicative that it goes up, at least somewhat, going into the third quarter. We'll have to wait and see. But this week we're still kind of in a holding pattern. Midwest looks good for some tender rejections, and the ports are still active. So there looks to be a lot in play over the next week or two. So let's wait and see. Everybody have a great week.